Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. This is the sixth session of Community, Pluralism, and Difference in Halakhic Practice. This week, as in previous weeks, we have had the pleasure of learning with Rabbi Ozar. Rabbi Ozar is a rabbi and co-director of the OU-JLIC program at Yale. He holds a BA and MA in Smicha from Yeshiva University and has published in Harvard Theological Review, Journal of Religious Ethics, and the Lehr House, among others. This class has been on how we want our communities to be as open and inclusive as possible, but communities require shared understanding and standards. Through a range of Halakhic case studies, we'll build a conceptual vocabulary for the complex work of community in face of deep difference. Who can and should we daven with, and how? Who can and should we dine with, and how? Who can and should we learn with, share a home or neighborhood with? What will emerge from our studies is a clear-eyed vision of the challenges of and opportunities of togetherness. Rabbi Alex, it's Ozar, it's good to have you back. Pardon me for the introduction, a little longer than normal, and I'm going to post sources for today's class in chat. And if you're on either platform, we want to hear from you. Post in chat. Speak out if you're on Zoom and you're a panelist. I can make you a panelist, or I can unmute you if you want to stay an attendee. And with that, I'm going to hand things over to Rabbi Ozar.
Okay, thank you so much, Kayla. It's good to have you back, and welcome back to everybody. Thank you as always to Trisha. Okay, I think we should dive in. I'm going to do my usual routine here, where I attempt to share my screen and get confused and then fix it. That's fine. Okay. That was pretty easy. All right, relatively smooth. Okay. So today, last week we through the case study, the example of the Eruv and who's in the community, the mechanics of creating and sustaining the Eruv community in particular, who's in, who's out, what you need to do, or how you mark different categories of people who are not quite in, how you bring them in, or how you say that mark they're not being in, they're non-Jews, if there's something in between. And one thing that emerged from that discussion was one of the critical conceptual tools that come to be taken up in later Halakhic writing for a kind of moderating mechanism, or a mechanism of inclusion that allows us to read, interpret deviance of those who are breaking from the norms of our community, allows to read their behavior in such a way as to allow their inclusion. So whereas on the one hand, as we saw, the laws of Eruvin are very clear that you need to be a Jew if you want to be a part of the family, the community, and you need to be the right kind. You need to be the kind that is a modeh Eruv, be someone who agrees to the broad set of rabbinic practices that mark your being a part of the full rabbinic community. And then we saw, and there are clear standards as to who's in and out, clear definitions, and there's seems to be a vital impulse to mark those distinctions and those standards. And yet, then we saw the category of somebody who violates Shabbat becomes a major category on the negative, on the exclusion side. The Mechal Shabbat B'far Hesia. Somebody who is, so we said somebody where there's a mere ideological difference. They're as firm as they could be, but they disagree with the rabbis about certain things. So this is the Sadducees, who are among the rabbis' biggest rivals. So there we wound up saying, fascinatingly, and we'll get into this a little bit more, it was fascinatingly, despite the deep differences between the Sadducees and the rabbis, they are basically Jews. So we require this very moderate mechanism of inclusion, but they're basically a part of the team. They may not agree with Eruvins, they're not automatically a part of the Eruv system if they don't want to be, but they're as much as part of the team as anybody. But then we saw there's the Mechal Shabbat B'far Hesia, somebody who violates Shabbat publicly. There's something different. We're not going to get into the theological background why it should be that violating Shabbos becomes the emblem of deviance, whereas somebody eating pork, it does not have quite the same standing, although maybe it should. But the idea is that the Mechal Shabbat B'far Hesia is somebody who's violating Shabbos and they're doing it publicly. They're attacking, undermining, subverting something so fundamental to our community, our solidarity, and who we are, what we're about. And if they're attacking it publicly, and they're undermining the economy, the public economy of mitzvah observance and commitment to Torah and mitzvahs and Yirat Shamayim, and to who we are as a community. If they're attacking that publicly and subverting it publicly, then they get pushed out of the community entirely. They're excluded, and they're treated for functional purposes like non-Jews, which is a pretty radical statement. Think about, again, just fast forward to 2024, just what percentage of the Jewish population is not Shabbos observant. So if we take that literally and seriously, just think you'd have to write off whatever the number is, 80% of the Jewish community. And so on the one hand, we're going to want to maintain the category. We're going to want to say there's something deeply powerful, deeply upsetting about the Mechal Shabbat for Hesed. We're going to want to sustain what having that category says. But we're also going to want, there's going to be a powerful impulse to try to moderate it a little bit. And so what we saw last week was a hint in the Gemara. So the Gemara says, it's already intimated in the very idea of it being b'far hesia, that it needs to be done publicly. So most sins, they're sins whether you do them at home or you do them in public. If it's between you and God, it doesn't matter where you eat the cheeseburger, it's the exact same avirah. But there's something for this purpose about declaring somebody in or out of the community. There's something about it being done publicly in face of the entire community, with everybody seeing. And because it is the claim we advanced last week, I think this is clear and I think well accepted, is that the category of the mumar, the apostate, the mean, is the sectarian, the person. When we're going to come today, look at the apikoros, because we translated the heretic. The people who are treated or categorized as outside the community, it's not about what they do. It's not about their own personal properties, characteristics looked at in isolation, and it's not about their relationship with God. That's between them and God. The community has very little to say about that. What matters to the community is what they do publicly, and whether they are not only falling short of their covenantal expectations between them and God, but they are actively subverting everyone else's covenantal relationship with God. If they're doing that, that becomes our problem. And then we have to act. And the way we act is through social ostracizing and saying, well, if you're going to undermine our community, we're going to push you away from the community so that you cannot continue to harm us. But so already in the idea of b'far hesia, you start to see the beginnings of this line of thought. The next move, the Gemara said that if somebody so they're carrying something on Shabbos in public, and when they come across an Adam Gadol, they come across a rabbi. And when they see the rabbi, they hide the thing they're carrying. And nowadays it would be a cell phone. They're walking outside they're on their phone on Shabbos. And they're doing it in front of everybody. Everybody sees them. It's not an issue. They're not ashamed. But then they see the rabbi. And in the movie version, it's their childhood Melamed, their first grade Rabbi. Somebody they have nothing but good, warm memories of, and who they know how much this Rebbe cares about their spiritual well-being and where they are in Yiddishkeit. And just the idea, it would both be they don't want to hurt the Rebbe, and it would be a kind of humiliation to them, and there'd be a deep shame in walking around with their cell phone on Shabbos. And so when they get there, they hide their phone. So everyone else saw them. They violated Shabbat publicly, communally, flagrantly. But when they saw the Rebbe, they put their phone away. That, the Gemara says, is enough to say that they don't qualify as Mechal Shabbat for Hesia. Either because they've got some amount of shame, so that it shows that they still care on some level about this. They haven't totally written themselves out of the story. And because it's a measure of their relationship with the community. If they still have some minimal residual level of respect for the community's leaders, that shows that they're still a part of it, they're still redeemable, and they're still not completely undermining what the community is about. And so broadly speaking, as we said, it's not just about the objective facts of what the person's doing, but it's about them in relation with the community. And it has to be an over-the-top, direct violent frontal assault on the community standards directed at the community itself and at the basic foundations and structures of the community. And where we're going to go today is that there's a subjective element. We need to know not just and a psycho-spiritual element. We need to know not just what they're doing. We need to understand why they're doing it. What happened? How did they get from the kid in the Rabbi's first grade class to being where they are now? Why are they violating Shabbos in public? What's that about? What's that about for them? And what's that about for the community that sees them doing it? And what's that relationship going to mean now? We need to ask the subjective, the personal question. And so today we're going to introduce what becomes the single most powerful piece of conceptual halakhic equipment that subsequent generations of rabbis have in their toolkit for dealing with, for potentially including those who violate communal norms. So just to start, I want to raise the stakes a little bit. One brief text. We're going to use, there are a few word terms that get used interchangeably. I see there's a question coming in. Is there, from Lindsay, welcome back, Lindsay, we missed you last week. Is there a link between public defiance of halakha and the requirements for community cohesion that we talked about a few weeks ago? I think public rule breaking becomes a threat to cohesion. Certainly. And I think there'd be a range of things. Lindsay asking, so why is it that this frontal assault is such a big problem? And so part of it would seem to be that the community won't hold together in the right ways, or won't be able to hold together in the right ways. Certainly that's one major factor. Okay, so I want to raise the stakes a little bit. There's a set of terms that show up together all the time. They're clustered. Often they're actively interchanged within the Talmudic text on account of the censors in the Middle Ages. There are questions, or places where it should have really said Christian, and it would have looked really bad if it did say Christians. They put it in a different text. They could have said Notzri. And then there's like the word mean, which means something like sectarian, that also can just sort of be used interchangeably with mumar, which is translated as apostate. As any given text, and sometimes there's the word kuti, like Sumerian. All these things tend to get jumbled, and if you really want to be scientifically precise, you often need to check the manuscripts, the older manuscripts, to see exactly what's happened and why. Sometimes there were reasons to want to obfuscate exactly which group we're talking about, but they all connote some form or other of deviance. These are people who have set themselves apart from the community, either through belief or action. Belief tends to be a subset. We'll focus on that next week, of people who are heterodox. They believe the wrong things or profess the wrong things, profess the wrong ideas or doctrines. And then there are people who deny the idea, the claim that the Torah is from heaven, or they deny that Mosaic prophecy, or they deny the existence of God. They deny the reality of reward and punishment and justice. And then there are people who are falling short behaviorally. So it could be either the full mumar, the apostate who becomes a Christian, they're baptized, and it can be somebody who is just, they don't keep kosher, they don't keep Shabbat. And then there are people in between who join like alternate Jewish sects. So in the classical rabbinic period, this could be, they become a Sadducee, they become an Essene, they join the Dead Sea sect or whatever it is. They become a Christian in the early period where it wasn't so clear what the difference between Jews and Christians was. And in modern rabbinic thinking, this can be conservative or Reformed Jews. They go to a different shul with a different set of standards and different architecture. And then it's not just something that they do, but it's an identity that they identify as a different denomination or sect of church. So let's keep all of those kinds of concepts in mind when we see the terms in play. So just to start, source number one, here I have everything in translation so you can read along on the side. The Tony Rabbi Yavo Kamed Rabbi Yochanan is a teaching, Ovdei Kochavim, when it comes to non-Jews, who Jews in the Mishmai period do not get along with. And these are think of them as like full pagans. Take the most obnoxious picture of a barbarian you can come up with. Viroe Behemadaka, and those who is a really interesting category, those who are shepherds for small animals. And the idea is that they engage in various forms of theft. just as a part of their natural course of business. Lo ma'alin v'lo moridin. We don't raise them up and we don't put them down. What does this mean, raising up and putting them down? It means that if you're walking alongside them, and on the other on the other side of the non-Jew or the shepherd of the small animal is a pit, you should not push them into a pit. This is an instance of the general injunction against murder. Murder is bad, and you shouldn't do it in these cases. But if they're already in the pit, you know, save them. You're not going to get a ladder and help them out. Good. It's one less non-Jew in the world. Wonderful. Great. Okay. So that's a long Halakhic history. If that was disturbing to you, I promise you this gets heavily qualified, and it's certainly not the way we relate to contemporary non-Jews. But just hold that, as we need it for the contrast. Aval haminin v'hamasurot v'hamumarim. The sectarians, the people who believe the bad things, they're Jews who believe bad things and do bad things. Masurot are informers. These are people who get their fellow Jews in trouble with the government, which is presumed to be unjust. The hamumarim and apostates, people who are violating the law and or are in some way have switched their religion. I think in the Gemara it tends to mean people who are just systemic violators, transgressors. In those cases, moridin v'lo ma'alin. In those cases, you push them into the pit. So this is, as I've been saying, as much as I'm making a kind of case for inclusion, and I'm wanting to demonstrate and pluralism, and wanting to demonstrate the capacities, the equipment we have for inclusion. The Chazal need it to be the case. We're very clear about the stakes of conformity and communal standards. And if you violate the standards and you're in tension with them, then at least in principle, we want to say that we ought to be trying to kill you. There are a bunch of other examples like this I could have brought. The Halacha is a Sefer Torah written by a non-Jew. I see there's a question I'll get to in a second. A Sefer Torah written by a non-Jew you can't use it, but it's fundamentally fine. And a Sefer Torah written by a an apostate or a sectarian, you burn it. You simply cannot allow, and we need to actively, even violently, oppose any engagement, any possible social relationship with these people. Okay. Are we sure that raising up will refer to saving and killing respectively? Yeah, we're pretty sure. If you have contrary evidence, in context, it's very clear. Yeah, and I see that there's. Did I mean to equate rabbinic Judaism, Orthodox Judaism? Absolutely not. If I did say something like that, I didn't mean to. There's I think a clear genetic relationship. If I flatten those two things, I do not.
Okay.
Thank you for pointing that out. As I was saying last week, and we'll get to at the end today, there is a strong sense in which Orthodox Judaism is a modern creation. Just because if you go back to the 16th century or the 15th, the 14th, 13th century, Jews were they may have been more or less observant, they may have been more or less learned, but everybody was the same kind of Jew. I mean, there were Karaites, there were other groups around. But if you were within the rabbinic world, there's only one denomination, only one stream is the term we use now. There wasn't like signs. And no one knew the term Orthodox. There was no term like that. You were just Jews. And it was just obvious to everybody that we're bound by the law, and you either fulfill it or you don't, and you deal with the consequences. It's only once in the 18th, 19th century, once you have a strong reform movement that is saying we want to do things differently and have different standards and different practices, then you get a retrenched contrasting identity. Says, no, we are Orthodox and we're going to police our boundaries as Orthodox. So there's part of what I hope I've shown is that what the Orthodox Jews are doing in the 19th century in Germany, Hungary, what they're doing has a deep and long genealogical lineage. They're building on classical rabbinic moves and using classical rabbinic equipment to draw those boundaries and to talk about the importance of those boundaries. But there's also a sense in which it's a modern term. Okay. So now we've set up the stakes and we've made clear that, again, the mumar, these people are they're not just out like in the case of the ear, we just said they just don't count. Here we're saying they are to be violently opposed, attacked, killed. I don't imagine any case where this was ever actually done, but it was important for the rabbis to say this. Okay, so now we're gonna take a little bit of work, and I want to show you part of what I want to see is the rabbinic ingenuity that went into developing this category. It wasn't, if you just read the Talmud, which we're going to do in a second, you or I, you might be a genius and have the same set of rabbinic sensitivities and just form of imagination that Chazal did. I would never have come up with this. But they read this text and then use this. It's really later on in the early Middle Ages that this idea is developed in a way that provides a ground for inclusion. So the context is a very technical Mishnah, Masachet Shabbat. The technical question is about if you engage in multiple violations, multiple transgressions, how many offerings do you need to bring? Korbanot Chatan. So if you violate Shabbos once, so I go out on Saturday afternoon and plow my field, and there's just like one episode of plowing. So and if I do it intentionally, I get the death penalty if I'm caught and warned properly. But let's say I do it unintentionally. I forgot it was Saturday. I thought it was Sunday. So in that case, I bring one korban chatas. Now, we're going to see what happens if I do multiple different forms of melacha, different forms of labor. I plow the field and I also cook something. So that's one kind of question. And now the Mishnah is going to introduce a different set of parameters. The klal gadol amru b'Shabbat. There's a great principle that they said with regard to Shabbos. Kol shocheach ikar Shabbat. Anybody who forgets the basic idea of Shabbos. Not totally clear what this means, but they forget about Shabbos in general. The asam lachot harbe b'Shabbatot harbe. And having forgotten about Shabbos, this is just, I want to leave that in your mind. So you're thinking about what could that mean? Forgotten about Shabbos, not just that today was Saturday, but just they forgot about Shabbos generally. And then as a result of having forgotten about Shabbos, the asam lachot harbe, they do many forms of labor, b'Shabbatot harbe, on many Saturdays. So einu chayav el chatat. They're only liable for one single sin offering because it's only one episode of sin. Would one shicha achat or helem achat. There's one episode of forgetfulness or negligence. So even though they've done many things, it's all explained by this episode of forgetting, of not knowing, the unawareness of Shabbos, and so it's all considered, it's wrapped up into one act, and so you only bring one korban for expiation. Now, hayudea ikar Shabbat, if you know Shabbos in general, v'asam lachot harbe b'Shabbatot harbe, chayav al kol Shabbat b'Shabbat. So you know about Shabbos, but then you keep messing up every individual Saturday, and you keep forgetting that you keep thinking it was Sunday every time. So in that case, you're liable for each cluster of melachot that you do on each Shabbat. So if I did a bunch of different melachot on the first Saturday, I bring one sin offering for that week. Then I do a bunch more melachot on the next Saturday. I bring one korban for that. Great. Hayodea shehu Shabbat. If you know that today is Saturday, you know it's Shabbos. The asam melachot harbe b'Shabbatot harbe. Then, and you still do multiple melachot because not because you forgot it was Shabbos, but because you forgot this thing was forbidden. You forgot the plowing was forbidden, and you went out and plowed the field, or you messed up. So in that case, you're liable for each individual form of labor, or each act. Now, ha'osa melachot harbe me'ein melacha achat. If you do multiple melachot that are like the same form of labor, they're like subcategories of the same thing. Then einu chayav el chatat achat. So if there are two things, if we can subsume some of them under one category, one kind of work, then you're liable for only one offering. Okay, that's all background. Then there's a long discussion, and the Gemara asks, a bit of a debate about what this case of hashocheach ikar Shabbat is. What's it about? What is that? Rav Shmuel the Amri Tarayu, Masnisen Betinok Shenishba Levein Hagoyim. It's about a child who is abducted among the nations as a child, and it's hard to read at the very moment their children abducted and living among the nations. But it's a conceptual case, children taken. And so the point is that they're Jews, and we discover later that they're Jews, and thank God we get them back. But they never learned about Shabbos because they were abducted and they never heard about Shabbos. Or an easier case, Ger Shanit Gayer Levanagoyim, just a convert who manages to get themselves converted. They grew up among non-Jews and then they converted and never learned about Shabbos. Nowadays, no reputable Beit Din would allow that, but assuming they got through the conversion process and somehow never learned about Shabbos. Aval, the Gemara says, Hikir L'Besof Shachach, if you, at any point on this version of the Gemara, this is why this case has to be generated, on this version of the Gemara, if you at any point knew about Shabbos, you can't then say you forgot about it. That's not a real thing. And so in that case, you would be liable for each Shabbos. But so Rav and Shmuel's view is that the only way this could possibly, what the Mishnah seems to be saying could possibly be true, is if you were, and what gets taken up is just the first case, which I think just because it's first, if you were like a child who was abducted and then taken among the Gentiles, such that you never at any point knew what Shabbos was. That's the only possibility of being somebody who doesn't know what Shabbos is, and therefore being off the hook for every individual violation. Okay, so just from that, and again, I don't know what I would construct from this if I was, say, looking out today at the whatever percentage of it is, I assume 80% or something of Jews worldwide who are not Shomer Shabbat according to rabbinic halacha. I'm not sure I would have known how to get from this text to thinking about that case. But I'm going to throw, that's what we're going to get. Now I'm going to throw a couple other just pieces of conceptual equipment that get wrapped up into this. So in the Gemara in Chulin, a discussion about various people who slaughter animals. And the question is the animal kosher if they're slaughtered by the wrong people? So the Gemara says that shlitat oved kochavim, actually if a non-Jew slaughters an animal, it's a nevela. So it's merely not kosher, but you could sell the meat, you could use it for other purposes. It's not like strictly forbidden bahana. B'nicho shema minhu, the Gemara says, but should we worry that the person was not just a non-Jew, but they were like that person we saw should be pushed down into the pit? That this is a real heretic, an apostate, a sectarian. I think real here seems to be a stand-in for idol worshiper. And if the animal was slaughtered with idolatrous intent, it should be forbidden to get any benefit from it at all. You should have to destroy it. Rav Nachman Rabbi Ravua, ein minin be'umot ovdei kochavim, ein minin be'umot ovdei kochavim. Fascinating phrase. There are a few different ways to read this. It seems to mean that there are no heretics among the non-Jewish nations. There are no such idolatrous people. It's parsing the language is a little difficult, but there are no there are no heretics, there are no sectarians among the other nations. Then the Gemara says, but look around. There are lots of idol worshippers among the nations. How can you say there aren't any? And so how we have to worry if the animal is slaughtered by a non-Jew, that it was slaughtered by an idolater, slaughtered with idolatrous intent. It says, in rov ovdei kochavim minin. And it says, right, in fact, like most of them are. Some are like Kihadam or Chia bar Ava, Yochanan, Nachrim shebechutz haaretz lav ovdei ovodos kochavim hein. The idolaters outside of Eretz Yisrael, another super interesting claim, but your average idolater out in the diaspora, they don't count as idolaters. Why? Rather, el minag aboseihan biyadeihan. They're merely following their father's practices. Not clear why that's different. In fact, we think it's a very standard, good, honorable Jewish line of thought that one of the best reasons to could carry on our Jewish practices and beliefs and ways of life is precisely because our parents did, and our parents raised us to do that. And yet here, the Gemara is using this as a marker of a kind of inauthenticity, saying no, they're not real believing idolaters. They don't really mean it. They're just doing what everyone in their society does. They're just doing what their parents told them to do. They're not real. It's not the real thing. But then we have to ask, and just what would be the real thing if born and raised, dyed in the wool, non-Jewish idolater. They were raised their idolatrous practices every morning and afternoon, and they were raised going to the temple, and everyone in their family and everyone in the neighborhood and the community and their summer camps and their after-school activities, it was all idolatry all the way down. That doesn't count precisely because that's what everyone did and that's what their parents did. I'm not going to drill in here, but just flagging this as just a fascinating concept. It's the thing we need to unpack. And then the last piece, before we get to today's big event, Gemara in Makot, it's discussing the killing b'shgaga, if you kill somebody unintentionally, without malice. So you don't get the death penalty. There's no capital punishment for killing, manslaughter in that case. But there is a standard punishment where you are sent to the city of refuge, the Ir Miklat, lest the blood avenger of the deceased comes to kill you. Debate about whether they should kill you or they're merely licensed to. But then the Gemara discussing this, so quotes are an earlier source, Tanur Rabbanan. Bishkaga, so if you kill unintentionally, prat lamezi. That's as opposed to killing intentionally. Because if you kill intentionally, you're simply put to death, and you can't go hide in the city of refuge. We'll take you from the city of refuge and kill you. Bivli dat, and there's another phrase used in the verse. It says, and you do it, so bishkaga, unintentionally, unwittingly, accidentally, and you do it without knowing, without malice aforethought, I think is something like the legal term. Prat limitzkaving, as opposed to doing it on purpose. And then the Gemara says, Mazid Pshita Bar Katala. Wait, hold on. We don't need the verse to tell us that somebody who kills intentionally doesn't get the protection of the Ir Miklat, the city of refuge. Of course they don't, because somebody who kills intentionally gets put to death, and we already know that, most human. So Amar Rava says, Prat Omer Mutar. Says it's as opposed to, so as to exclude the category of somebody who, not that they killed the person accidentally, that it was just a physical accident, they slipped. But it's as opposed to somebody who says it's permitted. They think, and maybe situationally specific, there was some scenario in which they thought, or just in general, somehow they thought, or they say they thought, that it is permitted to kill, or it was permitted to kill this person in this scenario. And if they say that, they didn't say it wasn't an accident, I meant to do it, but I thought it was allowed. In that case, the Rava says they don't get the protection of the Ir Miklat. Then Abaye says, well, Abaye Omer Mutar Anusu. Says, hold on. If the person really thinks, they sincerely believe that this was permitted, then they were as if compelled. They've lost their agency because in the sense that they had no control over it. It just is a way of the language of anus, forced, compelled, is a way of removing any liability or ascription of blame. We can't attribute the fault to them because they thought it was fine. They broke a law, but no one told them it wasn't, or somehow they knew. They didn't know. And so the response is Shani Omer Mutar Karov He says, no, I think that somebody who violates the law because they didn't know the law, it's not the same thing as merely accidentally doing it, but it's also not a noose. It's not like you were forced to do it. It's not like it was out of your hands, because you could have figured out what the law was, especially in a case like this. So the debate here, we have introduced the concept of the Omer Mutar, somebody who just thinks it's permitted. And then there's some subsequent debate about how liable we want to hold people for knowing what the law is if they don't know. And so you can see how this could both support and come in tension with the Tinok Shinishbal Vein Hagoyim category, where they simply never learned. And so then the question is going to be, to what extent do we want to hold them accountable for learning and finding? Okay. All of that is the introduction to our main event for tonight. So welcome to our main event. This is a passage from the Rabbi. This is Mishnah Torah, is the classic legal code. The discussion is Hilchot Mamrim, the laws of rebellious people. There's a case, if the series went on for another few classes, we might do the case of the Zakein Mamre, the rebellious elder. There's a really fascinating set of principles about somebody who engages in a debate with the rabbinic authorities and then refuses to back down. But in that context, so the Rambam says, Misha ena moda b'Torah shebal peh, somebody who simply rejects the entire framework of rabbinic law. Eno zaken mamre Torah. That's different than the rebellious elder. The rebellious elder agrees to, they're a part of the system. There's just a local dispute about a particular law. But somebody who completely rejects the framework entirely is something else. That is like they belong to the heretics. When it comes to the word Epicurean, the rabbis also have folk etymologies what Epicurus means, just translated as heretics. And the Rambam says, as we saw earlier, umisa so b'chol adam. It means anybody is licensed to kill them. Maybe should kill them. That's what we saw. You should push them into the pit. Somebody who rejects the framework of rabbinic law. Once it becomes well known that this person denies the oral law, moridino says, this is exactly the text we saw earlier. We push them down, the loma alin, and we don't rescue them. And they're like any other heretic, and other people like those who say that the Torah is not from heaven, that Mosrin and people who hand Jews over to the Gentile authorities, the Mumarin and systemic sinners, apostates. Shekol Elu, all of these people, Einam B'chlal Yisrael, they don't count as Jews, and you ain't sarich lo le'edim, you don't require witnesses to their transgression. Below Hatzra'ah, you don't need to warn them like you normally do if you're going to put somebody to death for a transgression. Below Daini, you don't need judges. No, there's no due process. You see them, and you know that's well known, it's corroborated that they are systemic violators, they're heretics, they reject rabbinic law. You happen to be, you're in a situation, you're well equipped to do it, you're next to a pit, you kill them. Anybody who kills them, they've done a great mitzvah, and they have removed an impediment, a snare, from among the people. Because if you leave somebody like this, you leave a heretic as a part of the community, one thing leads to another, and the heretics will keep growing because this person's going to win followers, and other people are just, even if they don't win followers directly, other people are going to see that you can violate the law and get away with it. And that's fine. It's not a big deal. And they'll start doing it. They'll be influenced. And sooner or later, the entire communal edifice falls. And so stamp it out while you can, kill the person. So again, just as clear, as strident, as violent as you could be about needing to police our boundaries. But then the Rambam says something amazing. When are these words said? What's the parameters here? When does this apply? You have somebody who denies the law b'machshavato, in their mind, and based on ideas that appear to them, their own perception of the world. They are thinking on their own. They're engaging in rational analysis, and they come up with this idea that they should reject rabbinic law on their own. The halach achar dato akala, they follow their weak minds. The achar shrirut libo, and they follow the arrogance of their heart. The kofer b'torah shabal peh tchila, and they do it tchila. They're the first ones. They're the founders, the instigators. Just like Tzaduk Uvaitos, like the founders of the Sadducees and the Mahuthians. And so too, all of those in the initial circle. So we're going to see there are three categories. The first two, he says, they qualify as heretics. The first two is the original leader, the founder, the revolutionary, the radical. They see on their own, they discern that they ought to reject rabbinic law, they ought to reject the idea of Torah Mishmarim, some or other fundamental of Jewish law and thought, and practice, and they follow the arrogance of their heart rather than saying, look, I have these thoughts and these doubts and these questions, but I'm just going to do what the community does, and I'm going to bow to their authority, and I'm not going to rock the boat. No, they say, I am going to rock the boat, and I'm going to, because of my own mind and my own heart, I'm going to follow my own principles and convictions, and I'm going to tell other people that this is what they ought to do also. I'm going to do it publicly and flagrantly, and everyone's going to know that. So that person is Amin, and they should be killed. And they're the immediate followers, because the first people who see this guy, they've got the same, it's basically the same. Maybe they're not as smart and clever and original. But when they decide to follow him, they're breaking from the established community. They're breaking from the established authorities, the structures, and communal structures. And they're breaking with their families and their shuls and communities and schools. And they know they're upsetting their first grade Rebbe. And they are, of their own volition, willfully becoming heretics and apostates by joining these people and becoming their followers. But now here's category number 3. The children, and remember the Gemara in Chulin about the idolaters who are merely following their parents' ways. The children of these people who have strayed, and the children, their children's children, whose parents push them to the wrong views. V'noldu ben akarim, and they're born among the Karaites. V'gidlu atam al datam, and they were raised with these views, and they were raised by their parents with their parents' religion. Harihu kitinok shenishba b'neihem, they are like a child who's been abducted among them. It's not their fault. There's nothing they could do about it. It's just where they grew up. It's who their parents were. V'gidluhu, that's how they were raised. Ve'enu zariz lechos b'darkei mitzvot harihu kanos, and you can't expect them to follow rabbinic halacha, because it's if they don't have agency about that. There's nothing, it's not like if they tried harder, or they were more faithful, or they feared God more even. It's not like any of those things that they would be better rabbinic Jews. They're just not rabbinic Jews. They don't know they don't know from. So now he hesitates for a second. So even if they hear subsequently, they grow up and they're out in the street, they're hanging out at the pool hall, and they start hearing some rumblings from some of the rabbinic Jews and the rival gang and the other team, and they start getting these weird ideas that maybe Chazal's version of halacha is the right one. They come back and they tell their parents, actually, I heard from Shmuley that maybe this is how we're supposed to do it. Actually, like, we can use fire on Shabbos. We started beforehand. And parents are like, no, we don't want you playing with Shmuley. You stay away from him. So even though they hear a little bit afterwards, because after all, the Rambam says Shehu Yehudi, V'ra Yehudi. He does know he's a Jew, and he sees other Jews. But bottom line, he has no agency because he was raised with this false set of beliefs. And so this, he says, I think this applies to the Karaites nowadays, the Rambam says, who've been doing this for hundreds of years. This is just their religion. This is just how they practice. And so how should we relate to them? Certainly not as people we should push into wells, not as people we should kill, and we shouldn't be relating to them as enemies. We shouldn't be relating to them as the opposition. They're people we have a deep disagreement with, and we should keep carrying on the disagreement and trying to convince them that they're right. But that should be done precisely through love and not hatred and enmity. We should try to bring them back and help them repent, come back to the true way. And we should draw them in with words of peace and kindness and care and love. Until they come back to the Torah as we understand it. The point is, and again, you can't just look at at the fact that a person is violating the law. And we need to understand the social context in which they're doing that. And we need to understand the personal subjective meaning. And so, as I said here, that the most powerful tool that rabbis have throughout, from Rambam's era, even earlier, and to the modern day, the most powerful tool we have, and I'm going to show you some other tools next week again. The most powerful one we have is this idea that you cannot blame people for how they were raised. And I think you can expand this even further. And I think this is expanded even further because if you live in a day and age time where I said, there was a time in the Middle Ages where it would have been clear to virtually any Jew that there's only one way of doing Judaism right, and you either do it or you decide not to do it for whatever reason, but there are multiple ways of doing it. If you live in an age where, and let's take Orthodox Judaism here as normative, you take a Martian, just an objective observer, take a non-Jew, they don't know, they weren't raised one way or the other, and you ask them, what's the authentic right way to do Judaism? They'll say, I don't know. There's the Orthodox people do it this way. Within the Orthodox, there are some people do it this way, some people do it that way. They wear these clothes, that kind of hat, this kind of hat. These people seem to observe Shabbos this way. These people observe Shabbos that way. There are these people called conservative Jews and Reform Jews and Reconstructionist Jews. And so far as I can tell, they're all well organized. They all seem to have loyal adherents. They all seem to be a powerful sense of community. How should I know which one is right? And then you drop somebody in, and anybody who's just raised in this environment, and even if their particular family was Orthodox and Shomer Shabbat, according to Rabbinic Halakha, the fact of the matter is they see around them that there just are other options for how to do Jewish life. There's no voice from heaven coming down and saying this is the right one. And so somebody who comes to practice Judaism differently can be we don't have to read it. It might be the case that they're doing it as a matter of rebellion and because they want to make their parents mad, they want to make their community mad, and they're acting out. That could be and will be the case in some cases. But in other cases, it might reflect other psychological, spiritual impulses, and it may just be a matter of them just doing natural soul searching. And they live in a society in the modern West where we encourage individuals to figure things out on their own. We encourage a kind of autonomy and rational deliberation. And so people just think this is what I ought to be figuring it out, and they come to a different set of conclusions. And so here, just with the equipment we have, we're already starting to see, you can start to take the line that, well, we're not going to say they're right, and we're not going to say it's okay. Say we're desperate for them to come back. But we're going to try to get them to come back. We're going to do it through love and through divrei shalom. We're not going to do it with anger and enmity, and certainly not with violence, because subjectively, what they're doing doesn't have the meaning of rebellion. It has the meaning of just figuring stuff out and following the available options. I see there's a question here, and then we'll conclude with a 19th century version of this. I feel like knowledge and free will become key here. A person doesn't know what they don't know. You can always learn. One can always embrace halakha and do more or better when they have agency to choose. What happens when the practices in question are not so easily or willingly changed? Lindsay, tell me a little more about the question. What you have in mind?
I guess where I'm going with this is more about when there's a dramatic difference in vision about interpretation or what's allowable and what isn't, that it's one thing to say, like, for example, I grew up conservative. I decided I wanted to be more observant, so I took on kashrut and Shabbos, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But what happens if you have a fundamentally different vision for things that are allowable or things that you feel should be allowable under the auspices of what we now know as orthodoxy? And how do you work that within a community when there is a fundamental conflict that you can't just say, well, you could learn differently or do something differently?
Yeah, so a really great question, a powerful line of, a very rich line of thinking. I don't have a simple answer. But I just the categories we've introduced here, and just the way you'll see them play out, is that in those first few people who are the first ones to come up with this new way of doing Jewish life and come up with this adjustment to, say, Orthodox Jewish practice and culture. They're the first people who are going to say that we ought to allow something in our shuls that we never allowed before our communities. Those people are going to be attacked. They're going to have a really, really hard time. And we've seen some rabbinic license for that. The community has to defend itself. It's tragic because these people are doing it sincerely, assuming they are. In many cases, they are. But the way the community is going to feel attacked, and it's going to respond as if we're going to respond defensively. But what you can come to see, and what communities can do, and I think what communities should do in these scenarios, is try to engage in a kind of charity and generosity, and to see that these people are coming to this point of view not because they want to attack the community, not because they're opposed to solidarity. Sometimes these people are the most committed to the community, people who are begging for change precisely because that's what they just what they need. They could just leave. We're in modernity. There's nothing forcing them to stay as a part of it. They're demanding that something look a little different, something be allowed, something be welcomed, respected, precisely because they can't imagine being a part of anything else. And seeing that also just as a matter of, it's not willful rebellion, it is just who they are. And it's, even if we think it's wrong, we may come to see it's right, but even if we think it's wrong, they're wrong because they have been formed by society to be wrong. And that's just what we're seeing is not an individual acting out. What we're seeing is a reflection of social forces. So that's a kind of charity. It's also, in many cases, not satisfying because that doesn't give full respect to the person you're disagreeing with. It's a kind of, it's paternalistic. It's like, oh, you poor kid, you've been swayed by Western society or America or whatever. That's why you're so confused. And so next week, I'm going to do something more powerful. But just here, like, those are the kinds of moves we made available to us, and to try to read these people as not rebelling, but as either sincerely trying to make things better, or at the very least, just doing it because as a function of the society around. One more question, then we'll finish up. The elephant in the room for me is that Ozar were innovators, and so were many Jewish thinkers around and attacked in their time. One of the elephants, anyway. Yes, I mean, absolutely right. So the Rambam is an amazing example. The time the Rambam was widely attacked, he's also widely respected. And that first generation of Rambam followers, the books are burned. It's really hard. Yeah, absolutely. And I think part of what we're seeing is, we don't, and it is what I called tragic before, is we're asking innovators to bear a very heavy burden, because we're warning, we may have to react violently. But we're also saying, if you succeed and you get enough people to follow you and you win purchase for your view, and then it just becomes a part of the landscape. At that point, if you succeed, then again, we're not going to agree with it, but we're not going to dehumanize you either. In fact, we'll welcome you in. So you have to shoot the moon if you want to be a rabbinic innovator. You'd be willing to accept the upfront cost of, they may attack me now. But knowing that if you do well enough, you get enough followers that it's just part of the landscape, then you win at least a kind of inclusion. Okay, we're going to skip his material, just saying that there's some pushback in the later Middle Ages against the Rambam's view. They start saying, well, maybe that was true for the Karaites in the Rambam's day, but our Karaites, we've told them 100 times how to do mitzvot properly, and they still don't do it. They know full well they're completely culpable. And so you start seeing that there's a kind of instability to the category, because we're evaluating the subjective, personal, psychospiritual bearings of the actual persons, and then it may be the case that sometimes we can do it charitably, sometimes we want to be charitable, and there may be cases where we don't want to be charitable, or we just have trouble. It's not plausible to be charitable in the right way. Some people just are rebellious, and some groups just are rebellious, and they really should know better. And so it's important to see that there is real pushback. So, but I wanted to conclude with a early example in the 19th century. I think it was the first like modern example of this being invoked. And we're not going to read the entire thing, even just the piece I have. But it's from a response of Binyan Sion, Jacob Ettlinger in mid-19th century Germany. He's asked a question about including a Sabbath violator in Machal Shabbat and public Sabbath violator in Shul. And so he goes through a Halakhic discussion about the category in general. And then he says, but hold on. And it's interesting, this was appended after when it was published by his son. It says, Psakim shlo laha masa, rulings not intended for practical use. He was deeply anxious about putting this out. It was a kind of trial balloon to see, like, would rabbis accept this reasoning? He said, look, we've been speaking about the law itself. But what should we say about contemporary sinners? I don't know what to say. Nowadays, it's not just individuals. The skin lesion has spread. It's the majority of people. And such that for the majority of people, most people think that worshiping, or that violating Shabbos is just permitted. It's fine. And we may even say that they're like this, the Gemara Makot we saw, that they're like people who just simply think it's permitted. And there are people who daven on Shabbos, and they make kiddush on Friday nights, and then they violate Shabbos. That's a total, he says, we've never seen this before. People who care about Shabbos, they're celebrating Shabbos, they're honoring Shabbos, and yet they violate it according to rabbinic law. This is crazy. And it's a totally new thing, because you can't say that they reject Shabbos entirely, and it's as if they're rejecting the idea that God created the world, because they're making kiddush and they're celebrating the fact that God created the world. So what do we do with these people? And everyone's doing it, and they simply think it's permitted, and they think that non-culpably. And then he says, and the children, and they've never heard of Shabbos. They don't know the difference, and they're just like the Sadducees, who we saw last week, don't count as apostates, even though they violate Shabbos, because they're simply doing what their parents told them to do. They're like a child abducted among the idolaters. They're not doing it out of rebelliousness. They're just doing it because that's what they think you're supposed to do, or they think it's fine. Or they think that the way you celebrate Shabbos is you sit down on Friday night, you make kiddush, and then you go out to a movie. That's just what you do. That's what their family always did. And so he says, I don't know what to do with these people. I can't call them simply Sabbath violators. They're not classical transgressors. They're not apostates, because they don't mean it. It doesn't mean the same thing to them. But he says, we're gonna need to confront this problem. We're gonna need to figure this out. And the problem only gets more pointed over time when the vast majority of Jews are not Shomer Shabbat. Okay, you said no need to answer this right away, but our time is running out. So I like the question about innovators. One follow-up that I have on it is that I guess a lot of innovators might describe themselves more as discerners who are showing how to better understand the original Torah. I guess one question is how to determine the distinction between those. Really interesting, sort of discerning and innovating. And I think one good way, if you want to be an innovator, is also to speak the language of discernment. And I don't mean that necessarily just as doing that dishonestly. But there are people who, this may be with the case of the Zaken Mamre. What they're doing is they've come to a different interpretation of the law, And what they engage in is a process of attempted persuasion. They go to their local court, and they go to the higher court, and they go to the Sanhedrin, and they try to win adherence. And then the question is, what happens when we get to the end and the highest court says no, and they say, yeah, so then we've got to sort that out. And it may be they've got to go home and leave it. We allow them to keep saying what they think is right. And that's a really important point of just rabbinic ethics, that you're allowed to say whatever. You're allowed to disagree with the rabbis. You can disagree with them publicly, criticize them. Like, you just can't recommend that people practice differently. It's a broader set of questions, both about the substance of what it means to, the possibilities are for creating new forms of Jewish practice through time. What can underwrite that, and then also how the established rabbinic authorities may and ought to respond. But I think we should leave things here. Next week we'll do more on the a further 20th century version of articulating a set of subjective, personal, spiritual conditions under which we can relate to those who violate the law with charity and generosity. Thank you all so much.
Rabbi Alex, do you mind turning off share screen?
Sure. Stop share. Got it.
Yep.
Okay.
Thank you. Thank you everyone who's came. We have 2 more sessions of this class. I hope you enjoyed the last 2. I want to highlight one class coming up on next week on Thursday, March 21st. Rabbi Silber will be teaching a class for such a time as this, Reflections on Purim after October 8th. The link to sign up is posted in chat. 85784.drisha.org/Purim. This will be meeting at 8 p.m. Eastern. And with that, though it is all, happy Adar and take care.
Thank you so much, Kayla. Thank you, everybody.
Bye.
Bye, Al.